different things like that, like things you would never think of, crazy stuff. We said yes a lot to mostly everything.
For more than 4 decades, the story of Richie Sambora and Jon Bon Jovi has been told like a rock fairy tale. 2 New Jersey kids who turned raw ambition into stadium-sized glory. Together, they helped build one of the most recognizable sounds in rock history. But behind the anthems, the tours, and the image of brotherhood, there were always whispers of tension, creative imbalance, and unspoken distance. Now at 65, Sambora has begun speaking more openly than ever before, revisiting those years with a clarity that feels less like scandal and more like reflection. What he describes isn't a sudden expose in the dramatic sense, but a slow unveiling of emotional truth, how success reshaped relationships, how fame distorts equality, and how silence can last far longer than applause ever did. Long before the world knew their names, Richie Sambora and Jon Bon Jovi were simply working-class musicians, grinding through small clubs in New Jersey. Their early paths were different but parallel. Jon chasing a frontman's dream, Richie building his identity as a guitarist with emotional depth and technical instinct. When they eventually came together in the early 1980s, something clicked immediately. Sambora didn't just play guitar. He added color, melody, and emotional structure to Jon's songwriting vision. Those early days weren't about fame yet, they were about survival, chemistry, and a shared belief that music could lift them out of ordinary life. In hindsight, this period is often remembered as the purest version of their partnership, before the weight of global success introduced pressures neither of them could fully anticipate. As Jon Bon Jovi became the face of the band, and Sambora became its sonic architect, an unspoken structure began to form. Jon was the voice, the image, and the public identity. Richie was the sound, the emotion, and the behind-the-scenes force shaping much of the band's musical direction. Together, they created a formula that worked brilliantly. Hits like Livin' on a Prayer, Wanted Dead or Alive, and You Give Love a Bad Name weren't just songs, they were cultural moments. But success has a way of freezing roles in place. Over time, what began as a partnership of equals gradually turned into a system where one man represented the brand, while the other increasingly felt like a supporting piece in a larger machine. As the band grew into global superstardom, the pace of life changed everything. Albums, tours, interviews, and branding decisions turned creativity into a constant production cycle. According to Sambora's later reflections in interviews and public comments, this is where the emotional shift began. He has described feeling increasingly distant from certain creative decisions, as if his input mattered less than it once did. Not in a dramatic overnight betrayal, but in small moments that accumulated over years. Studio sessions became more structured, less collaborative. Decisions became faster, more centralized. And the sense of being a co-creator slowly blurred into something closer to being a contributor rather than a core decision-maker. At the same time, personal struggles intensified the strain. Sambora has openly acknowledged battles with addiction, divorce, and emotional exhaustion during the peak years of fame. These experiences complicated his role in the band, making communication harder and vulnerability more difficult to express. While the public saw polished performances and unity on stage, behind the curtain there were growing emotional gaps. He has since described feeling misunderstood at times, and at other moments simply unheard. Whether that was due to the pressures of fame or the natural evolution of a long-term creative partnership remains part of a larger, more complicated picture. The turning point came gradually rather than explosively. By the late 2000s and early 2010s, Sambora's presence in the band had become more inconsistent, and the dynamic had shifted further. He has suggested in later reflections that he felt increasingly disconnected from the band's internal decision-making process. The role he once helped define no longer felt entirely his own. When he stepped away from touring in 2013, it was publicly framed as a temporary absence for personal reasons. But behind that moment was a deeper reality: burnout, emotional distance, and a growing belief that he needed to step back from a system that no longer felt balanced. What made the situation more emotionally complex was the silence that followed. There were no public arguments, no dramatic confrontations, and no official breakdown aired for the world to dissect. Instead, there was distance. Sambora later described the experience of being replaced on tour as deeply painful, not just professionally but personally, because it symbolized an ending that felt abrupt and unspoken. From his perspective, it wasn't simply about leaving. It was about how the departure was handled and how quickly life moved forward without him. That silence became its own kind of statement. Years later, Sambora's reflections have taken on a different tone. Rather than anger, his words have leaned toward accountability and perspective. He has acknowledged that he could have communicated more clearly and that his departure may have created confusion and hurt. At the same time, he has also maintained that his decision was driven by a need for personal stability and family priorities, especially his role as a father. This duality, regret mixed with justification, has shaped how fans interpret his story today. It is neither a clean accusation nor a simple apology, but something far more human and unresolved. Family, in fact, has become central to how Sambora frames that chapter of his life. He has repeatedly emphasized that stepping away from relentless touring allowed him to be present for his daughter during crucial years of her upbringing. In his reflections, he often contrasts the demands of global fame with the quieter responsibility of fatherhood. The message is consistent. Music gave him everything, but it also demanded a cost that eventually became too high. In choosing family, he redefined what success meant for himself, even if it meant walking away from one of the most successful rock bands in history. Meanwhile, Jon Bon Jovi has taken a different path in discussing the past. His comments over the years have generally been measured, focusing more on moving forward than revisiting old tensions. He has acknowledged Sambora's contributions to the band's legacy, but has also emphasized evolution, both personally and professionally. For him, Bon Jovi as it exists today is a continuing entity, not a paused reunion waiting to be restored. That perspective has made the idea of a full reunion increasingly unlikely, not out of hostility, but out of different visions for the present and future. In recent years, fans have continued to speculate about whether reconciliation or collaboration could ever happen again. But both men appear to understand that time has changed more than just schedules. It has changed identity, priorities, and artistic direction. Sambora's current musical approach leans toward blues-driven introspection, while Jon's focus has shifted towards sustaining the band's legacy in a more mature, restrained form. The explosive energy of their youth, while still celebrated, no longer defines their artistic reality. What once worked effortlessly now belongs to a different era entirely. Ultimately, what Sambora has exposed is not a single dramatic secret, but the slow emotional truth behind long-term creative partnerships under extreme pressure. Fame did not destroy their bond overnight. It reshaped it gradually, through distance, responsibility, and unspoken expectations. The story is less about betrayal and more about divergence. Two artists who once moved in perfect sync eventually began walking different paths, each shaped by personal growth, loss, and change. At 65, Richie Sambora's voice today carries a different weight, not the urgency of a rock anthem, but the reflection of someone looking back with honesty. Whether fans interpret his words as revelation, reconciliation, or simply memory depends on perspective. But what remains undeniable is the impact both he and Jon Bon Jovi had together. Their partnership defined an era of rock music that still echoes today. And even if the chapter between them is no longer active, its legacy remains permanently written into the sound of a generation.